Okay, so, is this one working? Yes, can everyone hear? Yes. Okay, great. Nicholas and myself are going to offer a presentation which is very much a kind of setting out some issues that we can develop in conversation with people and really thinking about the relationship between those kind of past struggles and triumphs which Professor Ramchand's just narrated for us, and how we might kind of in some ways activate possibilities and methods for a kind of recovery and awareness program around future archives and present archives as well. And I think really we want to think about two different things. One is the kind of practical measures we might take, but also not ignoring or being unresponsive to the fact that these exist within a particular kind of political field in relation to Caribbean archives. I hand over to Nicholas to give the background.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm involved here because a little more than a year ago, Alison got in touch telling me about this project, and she had an interest in finding out from a wide range of Caribbean writers what their perspectives are on their papers, their archives, what plans they had, were they aware of the value of what they owned, and just to sort of get a sense of what the writers, contemporary writers, younger writers of today are thinking about these issues. Because it's difficult enough tracking down and finding and preserving the papers of older writers and deceased writers, but there's multiple subsequent generations who are actively producing their archives right now, and sometimes unaware of the value of the material they're actually producing. So out of that, we did a pretty simple questionnaire with, I think, 5 questions on it, which about a year ago we circulated to a few dozen contemporary Caribbean writers, about half of whom I think actually responded to it. So it was not a very scientific survey and not incredibly comprehensive, but it was still very illuminating because we got a wide range of perspectives and some surprises from the responses to the questionnaire. But before we get to that, I think what I'm actually supposed to be doing is talking a bit about, maybe you need to click, about the background to all of this.
I'm on pointer. Okay.
Oh, go back one. Okay, cool. All right. Great. A little bit about the background. In other words, what is the state of the literary scene in the Caribbean right now, and how does this relate to the bigger question that you're all here to discuss about writers' archives? So the first thing to say is that from the perspective of a lot of us who are here, who are based in the region, is that Anglophone Caribbean literature seems to be in a very productive phase right now. I would say in the last half decade or decade. Certainly here in the Southern Caribbean, in Trinidad, there's a whole new crop of emerging writers, budding writers, who have, over the last 5 or 6 years, really begun to make their presence felt. They're publishing their debut books, they're appearing in magazines and journals, they're increasingly kind of energizing and kind of reactivating the literary scene here. And there are a few different reasons for that. Partly it's just coincidence and luck that this crop of talent has emerged at the same time. But there have also been a few institutions and projects that have supported these new writers, some of which have been in operation for longer than others, and the kind of gradual and cumulative effects, I think, are starting to be felt. There's an organization called the Cropper Foundation, which for about 10 or 12 years now has been running a biennial residential writing workshop that quite a lot of promising writers have passed through, and they have a pretty high success rate of writers who've gone on to publish and to be considered, major figures of this new generation. There's, for some years now, there's been an MFA creative writing program at the St. Augustine campus. The festival that I work with, the Bocas Lit Fest, is only 3 years old, but we have a special focus within the festival on new writers and emerging writers, and all kinds of programs within the festival and outside the festival itself to support them. One of which, for instance, is we've helped set up a prize called the Holic Avon Caribbean Writers Prize, which is specifically a prize for new writers, for emerging writers, that supports a writer in completing a manuscript, gives them financial support, but also logistical support, introduces them to agents and editors, and kind of inserts them into the networks that can help them. There's now literary festival in almost every island in the Caribbean. I don't think there are very many islands that haven't at least tried it. Some of them better established than others. You know, the Calabash Literary Festival in Jamaica is the one that's been around the longest in the Anglophone Caribbean. It's probably the best known, but there are festivals now in Barbados, in St. Lucia, in Dominica, in Antigua. Here in Trinidad, there's a small one in Tobago, there's one in St. Martin, there's a theatre festival in the Bahamas, and there are kind of smaller projects and initiatives in almost every Anglophone territory in the Caribbean. So the effect of all of these things has been to kind of energize a new generation of writers. So there's all this writing activity going on, all this, you know, talent and raw material that's being produced. What we still don't have, and Alison hinted at this in her introduction earlier, is that we don't have necessarily the infrastructure to support all this. Because as we all know, it's fine for writers to write, but that's not the end of the story. The literary ecosystem has to include many other species, let's say. So you need to have editors and publishers, you need to have booksellers, you need to have reviewers and magazines and newspapers that are willing to publish, to commission and publish book reviews. You need people who run festivals and writing programs. You need, TV shows that are willing to host authors and radio hosts that will bring writers and their programs to publicize them. And of course, you need readers and librarians and archivists, and these all kind of work together to kind of, when we talk about literature, it's not just this disembodied body of texts somewhere, but it's actually all of these things that are actually making literature happen. So we're still working on that. There are good practical reasons for why, after all this time, since the Stone Age, as Ken put it, we're still struggling with some of these issues. The Caribbean is, if you add the populations together, it's quite sizable. There might be 8 or 9 or 10 million of us in the Anglophone Caribbean, and if you, and our main diaspora centers in Europe and North America, but we're scattered across thousands and thousands of miles, many small territories. And in many of those places, there simply aren't enough people to create the critical mass that will support these kinds of things. So you talk to anyone in the literature business in the Caribbean, and you'll hear very quickly that we don't have publishers who are willing to publish fiction and poetry, that most of our writers still have to go abroad to be published, that many islands don't have decent bookshops, or there may be one bookshop that's sort of carrying the weight of serious book selling for an entire country. And this, of course, extends to things like literary archives. There are still very few institutions in the Anglophone Caribbean that have the resources or the interest to seriously acquire and preserve and maintain literary archives. So this is where the politics of location comes in, I guess. I think it's also important to note that the Caribbean, of course, is not uniform. As most of you know or can guess, that circumstances can vary considerably between one territory and another. So you have big islands with a population in the millions and with relatively large budgets. You have small islands that are independent nations, but whose entire population can fit in a cricket stadium for one match. So there are big differences in cultural priorities, in financial priorities, and resources. And so it's very hard to think of solutions that work for everywhere. It's very hard to come up with answers to questions that are equally useful in every location. I would have to do the math. I don't even remember exactly how many specific independent or distinct territories there are in the Caribbean. It's something like 24 when you add up the independent countries and the ones that are still colonies and the ones that are actually part of metropolitan France or the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So it's a big challenge to sort of fit all of this into one framework. And yeah, okay. And the other important thing to remember is that in the Anglophone Caribbean, certainly, these are all relatively new countries. Right? Trinidad and Tobago has been independent for just over 50 years. Jamaica the same. And the Stone Age is not that far away. It's not that far back. And in the process of kind of creating a nation, an independent nation, obviously, governments and policymakers and civil society has certain priorities. And the whole idea of heritage, whether that means writers, archives, and manuscripts, whether that means historic buildings, whether that means research into history, oral history, the whole notion of heritage and preservation is is a tricky one. It's, for the most part, it's underfunded, and it's also in the places where there is some kind of attention or there is some kind of policy in place to work on these aspects of heritage, it tends to be very much tied to immediate, a notion of immediate income generation. So, for instance, the islands in the Caribbean where historic architecture is best preserved are those that have a tourist market, people who want to come and visit a great house and stay in a plantation house that's been converted to a hotel, or have tea on the veranda. In Trinidad, where tourism is a very small part of our economy and not very important at all, we seem very happy to let old buildings fall down. There's no reason to keep them standing. There's no financial incentive. And we've never had a government that's been able to understand why it might be important to preserve our built heritage, much less something like, the papers of a dead writer whose books may or may not even be in print. So the summary of all of this is that there seems to be a big imbalance between the energy of the contemporary literary scene and what the contemporary writers are actually doing, the material that they are producing, and our ability to to keep track of the paper trail, our ability to archive the process of their creativity. There are quite a few deceased writers whose papers are lost or missing or gravely endangered. The Guyanese writer Martin Carter is one. It's a particularly worrying one. Carter died in 1997, and his wife died more recently. His entire archive and his entire library still sitting in his house in Georgetown on Lamaha Street, in a wooden house, like many traditional houses in Guyana. And it would not take very much more than one match or a candle falling over for the entire thing to go up in flames. And the Carter family, his heirs, none of them live in Guyana, and there's currently no one. I mean, the papers are simply sitting in an almost empty house, and there's no one taking care of it. So God knows what's going on with termites and bookworms and leaks from the roof and people, breaking in to see what there might be to steal in the house. That's just one extreme example that can be, that's replicated over and over again. And the other thing that's a bit concerning is that if we can't even manage to agree on how to deal with the archives of a writer, let's say as major as Carter, who I would say is one of the half dozen major writers that's come out of the Caribbean, then what about all of the new writers, the emerging writers, who are in the process of creating their archives, perhaps not recognizing the value of the material they're actively generating, and maybe, in fact, disposing of or dispersing this material almost as fast as they create it, simply because no one is telling them it's important and they don't know what to do with it.
Just to follow on from that with another kind of anecdote of last summer, I was working with the writer Unya Kempadu, who is, a very prominent woman writer in the region, and we were actually working on meeting with people about a small cupboard library, because of the situation in Grenada being so fragile and there being no public library. And then I turned to Unya and I said, "What have you done with your papers?" And she said, "Oh, I was just about to chuck the manuscript of All Good Creatures," which is her last novel. So this kind of disconnect really as well between a kind of awareness about the problems and an awareness about, the possible solutions of keeping things. And one of the things that Nicholas and I have talked about and have noticed is actually in the Caribbean situation, and perhaps kind of moving on from the situation Ken described, where as a scholar he was very connected with the people in the archives and with writers from that generation, that now actually still academics and people who are organising literary festivals are the people who can actually connect authors to archivists, because there's not so much of literary agency, there's not so much kind of awareness really amongst the writers about the kind of appreciation perhaps of not just their front room efforts but their back room efforts. And so that in a way, often as an academic you feel like, what value am I to the world? But this might be one way in which we can be directly valuable. And the same for Nicholas in his work in Bocas, and I think we've both had experiences of those style of encounters. The things that we thought, this is really difficultly sensitive. the thing, we thought that we'd just run through some of the contextual considerations before thinking about some practical measures. So again, just to build on what Nicholas has said, is, what are the uses of cultural memory in the Caribbean? Is this something that's really packaged and invested in for outsiders rather than for insiders? And what does that mean in terms of front room, back room interest? If cultural memory has to serve, a kind of touristic purpose rather than a nationalistic purpose. I'm just going to let them all come up because I can't control this. For whom does heritage need to perform in what ways? And also how are authors' self-perceptions and attitudes shaped by this? Because we were quite struck by the responses in the questionnaire where authors kind of said, what? Is that something that would be of interest? And even people that we know quite well who are writers saying, really, you think they'd want my papers? I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. So the sense in actually that perhaps there is some kind of circuit of cultural appreciation that's kind of failing to make visible the kind of value and significance and heritage depth of these sorts of resources. Do you want to talk about the others?
Yeah, well, just to add something to that, I think that for many younger writers, many emerging writers, their kind of day-to-day struggle in their career is who's going to publish their book. If there are no publishers here on the ground and they're still negotiating for the most part with publishers based elsewhere, their major worry is, will someone publish my next book and will anybody buy it? And it's very, very far from the front of their head. What do I do with all this paper that I may or may not be accumulating at home? Or increasingly, what do I do with all these Word files that I may or may not actually be backing up and I may or may not be keeping track of? The question of what makes writers think about their archives, that was something that was very illuminating about the questionnaire that we circulated, because it seemed that for many of the respondents, this was what made them think about their archives. Someone just asked the question, do you archive your papers and what are you doing with them? Many of them claim never to have thought about it before. It may be that some of them simply didn't want to appear immodest and that they had in fact thought about it extensively but didn't want it to seem that way. I don't know, but I think that many of them were genuinely surprised that anyone was seriously interested.
The other thing about intertext is thinking, actually kind of whether Caribbean archives need to we need to think about them differently in the sense of the literary archive is also intertexting very much with folk or oral culture. So when we give writers kind of advice on what the extent or the scope or range of that might be, whether we need to think about locally specific kind of questions in that regard. And then the last one, what is the effect for interpretation? Because depending where people's papers are, that means, where particular styles of critics can grow up, and if papers are based in the US, then the critical appreciation of those writers, it's very difficult for scholars here to get funding. Certainly young early career people and postgraduates to get funding, and so that's kind of is almost shaping the kind of future critical direction of the field, as well as its kind of material presence and substance, and that we thought that was an important issue to think about as well in terms of the politics of location. See if I can do this. Okay. So in terms of possible practical measures, and these are things that would be interested in having feedback on, the Register of Authors papers. So David's spoken about how the project has started a diasporic register, but independently of that, I've also been trying to start a register of Caribbean authors' papers. And somewhere along these slides, which I thought I could navigate forward and back very quickly, I did put a slide of the Wilson Harris papers just to show quite how, let's see if I can do it, quite how diasporic these papers are. Oh. I tell you honestly, seriously, Yes, could you? That would be great. Thank you. So this is Harris's papers, and you just see how University of Guyana has 1 box, University of the West Indies at Mona, 1 box, Lilly Library, Indiana University, 1 box, Harry Ransom, 12 boxes, Cambridge, 2 boxes. You really begin to see the extent of what it means for a Harris Scholar to want to look at all of that material. So the kind of diasporic nature of some of these collections. And I guess what's to be said there is we know where this is. And we know how much there is. And that's also, a very kind of precious record and doesn't exist for most writers. So the Register of Authors' Papers is one thing. And then maybe, Nicholas, do you want to talk about the questionnaire? I'll try and get it on the screen.
Just skip ahead to it.
Just
okay. The questionnaire we've been talking about. There were, I think, just 5 or 6 questions. And they're short. I'll read them out to you. So we asked in the first place, is your archive currently in your own hands? Those of friends or private collectors. I don't know, you probably can't read this because it's so tiny. That's why I'm reading it out. Is your archive currently in your own hands, those of friends or private collectors, or deposited with a library? Then we asked, do you keep papers relating to your writings and publications with an awareness of future scholars and researchers? If so, what do you keep? Do you consider electronic files to be part of your archive, and do you take any steps to preserve this material? Would it be helpful to have a fact sheet on how to build and preserve an archive? And then we ask, in deciding the location for your archive, please indicate which of these factors are of significance to you and in what order. And the 3 factors we asked them to rank were access for Caribbean readers, financial recompense, and preservation guarantees. So we got, I think, roughly 30 to 3 dozen responses. The writers were range very widely in age. There were a couple who were in their 70s and who had obviously at that point amassed a lifetime's worth of papers. There were a couple who were much younger and had only published 1 book, a debut book, and so at the start of their career, with most of them falling somewhere in between. And it was, the way we went about it was we started at last year's Bocas Lit Fest, so last April at the festival, and all the writers who attended the festival got a printed copy of the questionnaire to fill in. And then we circulated the same questionnaire by email to a fairly large mailing list of writers drawn on my contacts and Alison's contacts, and then nagged as much as we felt we reasonably could to get as many responses as we could. And they trickled in over the course of many months. I think it took about 6 months for us to kind of get what seemed like a reasonable survey. Do you want to talk about the responses to the questionnaire?
Yeah, I'd like to do that. I've got that up, actually.
Oh, okay. So what did they have to say? The first thing is, as Alison mentioned earlier, is that most of the writers, most of the respondents said that they'd never thought about this before. No one had ever asked. It never occurred to them that anyone might want to read their drafts or their manuscripts or their correspondence or their contracts, their publishers. So a couple of very typical responses there. The writer who says, I've never thought about any of this in relation to myself. The writers who had seemed to have thought about it, the few of them who had, were either they had some background as librarians or archivists themselves, or they were academics who had done research in other writers' papers, and so I suppose had that awareness in relation to their professional careers. But the majority of them, and especially the younger ones, basically said, my God, I've never thought of this before. Would anyone really want to see this? And there was a great deal of just sort of surprise or mock surprise or real surprise, I'm not sure. Most of them said that, yes, they did keep some material, but clearly very few of them are kind of keeping every single scrap of paper. And, they said things like, I keep my notes in case I need to, this is going to trigger something for my next book, or I need to sort of check something years from now. And they mostly seem to keep things either out of just inertia, because you don't, no one is such a great housekeeper and you just keep things, or because they felt they'd be relevant to themselves. Almost no one seemed to have the sense that they were keeping things for posterity or to do something, to send them off somewhere. There were a couple writers who actually seemed very upset at the idea of their archives going into any kind of public institution and ever being accessible to anyone. One of them refused to answer the questionnaire but sent Alison and me a long email. Actually, 2 of them did that. This is a quote from one of them. I'm not going to name any names, but there's one writer who basically said, I've told them to burn everything when I'm dead. And my favorite bit, the writer I rarely envy in this respect is Homer. Nobody knows anything about him or her or them because, Homer could be anybody. But for the most part, that was a fairly uncommon response. For the most part, people seemed open to the idea that their archives might actually be of some use to somebody, even if even if the idea was new to them. When it comes to digital archiving, things like electronic drafts and emails and so on, the general response was that it was pretty haphazard. People kept what they kept. They backed up some things. They didn't back up others. A few seemed alarmed at the idea of their email ever being of interest to anyone or available to anyone. So I think our notions of correspondence and what it means to correspond with someone has changed, a great deal in recent decades. We all send too many emails and too many silly ones. So the idea, I think, of anybody going through my inbox is very alarming. Almost everyone, with I think one or two exceptions, said yes, they would love to have some kind of fact sheet. Having raised this idea with them and piqued their interest, they all wanted to know more about what was the potential value of their material and what they should be thinking about doing with it. So hence, I think one of the key kind of practical things to take forward from this is that some kind of fact sheet or handbook would be extremely valuable, and there is actually a demand for it among contemporary writers currently working. When it came to telling us what factors they would use to decide where their papers should go if they went anywhere, most of them said access to Caribbean readers was important. A few of them kind of crossed out Caribbean and just said access to readers, or access to readers anywhere, or access to world readers. But access is clearly the thing that most of them felt would sort of sway them. Preservation guarantees came in second place, and I don't think anyone said that money would be their main consideration. There was one writer, again, I won't name any names. I can't remember, exactly who asked for the information to be used anonymously or not. But there was one writer who said very forcefully that she wouldn't want a European or Western entity owning Caribbean archives anymore, and seemed prepared to chuck everything into the sea rather than see it carried off to a library somewhere else. So I think we need to give her an alternative so she doesn't actually chuck everything into the sea.
Okay, we're going to wrap up by just quickly going through some possible other alternatives. Christopher, could you go back a couple of slides, which hopefully we can just talk about as the workshop goes on. So the Register of Authors Papers, we thought this author questionnaire, we thought we should follow that up by an institution questionnaire by collecting institutions about their collection policies, and also perhaps publishers, literary festivals, those kinds of institutions. And also that perhaps one thing that might be important for writers whose island home doesn't have an archive would be to have a register of repositories which could be benchmarked according to Access and Preservation Index. So we know, for example, that the British Library have recently acquired two important collections, the Andrew Salkey and the James Berry collection. But, in terms of their priorities, I know there is one PhD student who started working on the Salkey archive. I've seen a little bit of that myself. It's going to really need some very serious cataloguing, and I just don't know when those papers will be accessible. So I think that to have a register of institutions that are interested and committed not just to preserving and owning the papers, but actually to making them accessible could be a very useful thing, and whether there might be institutions here that could help us do that. Then we also thought that maybe we should have a bulletin of endangered archives, where different scholars or archivists or librarians in the region could actually add on collections that they know of that are currently endangered, and possibly that would be useful to know. And just generally, regional arrangements around rescue, preservation, access, but perhaps also just a lobby group for raising kind of the awareness, the profile and support, and just raising the significance of literary papers within, regional culture, where perhaps the heritage notion of heritage is positioned slightly differently, and priorities and resources are directed in a different way. I don't know if you want to close at all. No. Okay, so that's what we have to offer, and we'd be really interested in hearing people's feedback on that. We hand over now. I suppose we can move there, can't we?